BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. It's for 7 books, which, depending how long it goes on for, I might split into 2 different videos. See how we get on. So, Portrait of an Unknown Lady by Maria Gainza, translated from Spanish by Thomas Bunstead. The System of Vienna, a novel by Gert, Jonke, translated from the German by Vincent Kling. 3 to Kill, Jean-Patrick Manchette, translated from the French by Donald Nicholson Smith. Gilbert Adair, The Death of the Author. Night as It Falls by Jakuta Alikavazovic. She's actually French, and this is translated by Jeffrey Zuckerman. And then David Markson, Going Down. And finally, letters between David Markson and the poet Laura Sims. This is called Fair Forward. So I'm going to start with the Maria Gainza. She wrote Optic Nerve 2-3 years ago, which I pretty much liked. It was set in the world of art, as is this. A follow-up novel which has just been published, I think. And it's about 4 women. So although it's called Portrait of an Unknown Lady, it's really sort of portrait of 4 unknown ladies, as the protagonist is a young woman who seems to come from a wealthy background in Buenos Aires, and is sort of provoked by her uncle to actually do something with her life, and fixes her up with a woman who is the head of the sort of authentication department of art, sort of, you know, searching for forgeries and authenticating those that are genuine. And she's very much taken with this woman, and they forge a very strong bond, and the older woman sees her as potentially the person to pass the baton onto. And they're sort of very conspiratorial, and on page 16, so this isn't really a spoiler, this is very early in the novel, the older woman reveals that actually she issues false certificates of authentications because she's hooked up into a counterfeiting group, and she's the final part of the system whereby she authenticates their counterfeits. And there are several artists who are counterfeited, but one of them is an artist called Maria Lidas. So that's one of the women also. And then we also are introduced to the sort of notion of the woman who does these counterfeit. I mean, it's a whole group of people who do counterfeit, but they each specialise in different artists. And the one who's specialised in Lidas is a woman called Renee. So when this mentor woman dies of old age, the other woman is a bit bereft, so she immediately quits the department that she's been working on, but decides she's going to track down this mysterious Renee, and through that also sort of gets on the trail of the artist Maria Lidas. So there are 4 women in play. The protagonist is the one we know least about, ironically, because it's through her that we find out more and more about these 3 other women. And I think that reflects back on the sort of hollowness of who she is. As I say, in the beginning, she had to always be provoked. You know, she doesn't need to get a job, but she was sort of provoked to get it. That she's not really driven to do anything with purpose. That everything seems a bit of a sort of empty counterfeit, thing about life. But it's really interesting that the lives that she unfurls. So of Renee, who remains perhaps the most mysterious of them all, she doesn't know if she's dead or alive. She doesn't, she finds all these contradictory facts from the people who are still alive, who knew her, or at least claim to know her, who offer her every version of a sort of character trait, and then the next one will offer the complete opposite. That she was very sort of avant-garde, bohemian. She was addicted to heroin. That she regarded her own sort of counterfeiting as, if it's good enough to pass scrutiny, then it's a work of art in itself. And Maria Lidas, the woman who has been counterfeited, her work, is a really interesting section where, after she's died, lots of her papers come into the hands of the protagonist, and she is asked by the counterfeit ring to sort of draw up an auction sale of these items, to write sort of narratives of providence about Maria Lidas, and they can make lots of money about it. So we get this whole life of Maria Lidas that the protagonist puts together, but we don't know how much of it is true and how much of it is just made up for the sake of making money. So it's a really interesting and also a fun read, really. I don't think there's anything sort of, profound at the heart of it, but I just, it sort of gallops along. It's really interesting. You get these different characters, different concepts of art and reality and counterfeiting and all this sort of stuff. And I just really, really enjoyed it. So I gave it 4.5 stars. And on to The System of Vienna by Gert Jonke, who's an Austrian author. He wrote the wonderful geometric regional novel, which is one of the bizarre titles in literature, but actually sort of gives a good indication of what that book was, which is sort of a very sort of bureaucratic village and all its sort of statutes and stuff that you had to put in an application to take a walk in the woods, for example. And it was like sort of 6 pages long. So I think we can all relate to that. I mean, don't forget Austria, next door to the Czech Republic. It's, the world of Kafka. And in a way, that's sort of here as well. So the System of Vienna is its tram system or its streetcar system. And in a way, this is a Stations of the Cross for Gert Jonke. It's presented as an autobiography in some ways, organised and arranged along these sort of different tram stops that he's got off that mark different things in his life. It starts with birth and the bureaucracy of his mother, who winds up, ready to drop. And she winds up at the side entrance of the hospital. The guard there says, no, you can't come in. I'm under strict orders. No one through the side entrance. You have to go back round to the front. And they get into this sort of argument come discussion as to, how she wants to be let through and, all this sort of stuff. And by the time that she is given admittance to the hospital, the baby Gert Jonke is born blue. He lives, but obviously. And then the final chapter is it's a sort of presumption of his death, and unlike human transience, what goes on obviously is not mountains and forests, but it's the tram system. The tram system persists. The tram system does not alter its routes. So, and between that we get all these sort of quite extraordinary not adventures, but people that he bumps into who are all sort of representative in a way of sort of bureaucracy versus freedom. So there's a guy he passes who's locking up his sort of, he's pulling down the shutter on his shop, and it's he's a fishmonger, wholesale fishmonger, and he sort of says, well, actually, I'm the power behind the throne. The Chancellor, everyone thinks, is the guy running the country, but no, it's really his sort of speech maker. But it's not the speech maker. It's another guy behind the speech maker, and I'm the guy behind the other guy. So no one has any inkling that it's me who runs the country. But then he sort of complains that this sort of rather bureaucratic chain of command sees a lot of lost communication and lost energy. So he's sort of complaining. Now, of course, this guy could be completely out to lunch, but actually, something also rings true about it. There's a chapter where Jonke is thinking about suicide, and he's going to jump off a bridge. But the day before or the night before he goes to the bridge to do it, the bridge itself collapses and prevents him doing it in that manner. It's almost as though the bridge has sort of sacrificed itself and committed suicide to prevent Jonke. So there's all these very sort of strange things. There's another one where he sort of comes across a guy who throws back at him as they're sort of describing the interaction. This guy throws back at him that this is Jonke's written representation of their interaction. So at the same time as it's happening in real time on the page, the guy's sort of saying, no, you're writing this, you're reconstructing this after the event. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff in each chapter. It's very short. It's just over 100 pages. It packs a lot of ideas in, and it's very, very satisfying. 4.5 stars. And on to Three to Kill by Jean-Patrick Manchette, a sort of French 70s noir writer. I was turned on to this by Fraser Simons over at Springboard Thought. Again, another short book. And the reason why I'm talking about 7 books is a lot of them are very short. So I've had a reading week of powering through lots of books. And this is about a guy who's with his family, his wife and 2 daughters. He's a businessman. They've gone away for holiday at the end of July, just before the August rush of Parisians. They've beaten them to it, and he's in the water, and these 2 guys come up to him and try and deliberately drown him. And he manages to fight them off, but obviously it puts the fear of God into him. He doesn't know, who they are, why someone's trying to kill him, and he makes this spur of the moment decision that to protect his family, he goes on the run. And he doesn't tell them, he just abandons them effectively, and he sends a telegram to them saying that I'll explain it all after, I had to do this. And then we get to a series of sort of quite strange and surreal episodes where he ends up sort of in a garage filling his car, and the 2 guys try to kill him again. By this time he's armed himself, and he manages to sort of kill one of the guys in a sort of exploding fireball in the forecourt, with petrol having leaked over the forecourt, and then he manages to sort of strike a match and set this guy on fire. But he's wounded himself, and again takes off into the wilderness. And he's on a train, and a drifter attacks him with a hammer. So he's sort of just picking up more and more injuries, and he ends up in this sort of forest wilderness. Is picked up by a guy and taken to his hut. And what it is he's run out on his comfy bourgeois life of family and job, and he's had a sort of 180 life change under straitened circumstances of these guys trying to kill him. And we get a sort of a long section where he's sort of in this guy's hut, both while the guy's alive and then after the guy's died of old age, and the guy's granddaughter comes to tidy up his affairs, and this guy has an affair with the granddaughter. But then the remaining hitman tracks him down and shoots at him, but only kills the woman. He manages to kill the guy. So I'm not sure what this book is doing, really. This is the first time I've read Manchette. On one level, it's a thriller. Reminded me a bit of Rogue Trooper, the sort of 1910s, 20s version of a sort of an English guy who goes sort of to ground with people. Again, although he's the hitman in that, with the government sort of trying to snuff him out. But I think that it is looking at a bourgeois guy who throws everything away to escape that sort of cloying, stultifying life, through being forced to go on the run. And then, once he's wiped out the 3 people, who, hence 3 to kill, who are trying to kill him, then he goes back to his old life. He goes back, settles back to sort of suburbia and bourgeoisie lifestyle. So I wasn't sure really what to make of it. It's perfectly well written. It's sort of, apart from the long section in the woods in the guy's hut, it's reasonably pacey. It's quite brutal in places, but I gave it 3.5 stars. And on to Gilbert Adair, The Death of the Author. So I've never read Gilbert Adair. I know of him because he was the guy who translated Georges Perec's Avoid, which is the Aleppo novel, which is however many pages long, 300 pages long, without a single letter E. Perec wrote, and Adair is the guy who translated that into English, also without the letter E. So I've always sort of held a high regard for Adair, but never read his own work. And I saw this title, The Death of the Author, which is the working title of my own current work, so I might have to change it. But I thought, well, I have to find out how closely does this touch on my own novel. And I'm pleased to relate, it doesn't really, but this is a good, fun, rollicking read. So a guy is sort of falls into academia in France. He is the son of a guy, and they both experience deprivation in wartime under occupation of the Nazis in Paris. After the war, he has enough of a reputation that he manages to get a gig in America in their university system, and he puts to the sword all the sort of structuralist Roland Barthes death of the author by saying, well, so that theory is that Barthes pronounced the author dead because it's the reader, the individual reader makes the text, because the individual reader will interpret it in whatever way they do, and that gives the book meaning and weight and everything. And the academic in here goes, well, if you take that to its logical conclusion, then there's no such thing as meaning at all, because each reader will bring a different meaning to it, a different interpretation. Therefore, you can't privilege any one reader version over another. Therefore, no book has any meaning at all. And this catches fire in America and starts a thing. So that's the sort of the background. But there's some really interesting. The same little bit of text, for I guess about half a page, gets reiterated 3 or 4 times during the book. And you realise that's because this guy is rewriting his own personal history of how he ended up in America. That actually, during wartime, he may have had a different version of what is presented as his story to make it palatable, that he's not sort of toxic. And this happens 3 or 4 times, and he's very, the more successful he becomes in America, the more scared he is that the press will dig into his background and uncover things that may compromise his reputation, and which side of the sort of morality he stands on. And so it's very late on that we get the thriller element, the death of the author, literalised, where there are a couple of murders. And obviously I can't go into it any more of that aspect because of spoilers, but this was so satisfying. Good, rollicking, fun, quick read. I mean, I read it in a day. I loved it. 4.5 stars. And on to Jakuta Alikavazovic, Night as It Falls. So I saw Bob the Booker talk about this book. He said it doesn't seem to have been that widely known in England, and asked if anyone had read it. I hadn't even heard of it, but he made it sound interesting, and interesting it is. So there's this 20-year-old boy and girl meet at university. What they share is A, they stand out from everybody else. B, they've both lost their mothers early in life. And C, they both fall under the spell of a mentor university lecturer. Again, much like this, and also like Elizabeth Finch by Julian Barnes, his new book. But both of these are far more satisfying in their portrayal of the relationship of mentor to mentee. So those are the 3 things they have in common. What they don't have in common is she's very rich, she's an heiress, I think to a hotel chain, and he's very poor, comes from a very poor background, and she stays every night in one of the hotels in this chain, and he is a night watchman there on the reception desk. So they know each other vaguely from university, but once they're together in the hotel, they forge a relationship, and it becomes physical. And she has a tendency towards catastrophe. It's described as she knows the boundaries and the limits of everything, but wants to burst through that because she doesn't want to be contained by it. He is she basically blows up her degree. She flunks it on purpose. He's too motivated by his sort of fear of poverty. He can't afford, he's working, she isn't. He keeps to his degree because he needs a qualification in order to get a good job, kind of thing. So in that sense, they're very different, even though they're in this relationship. And the theme that this mentor professor pursues is the anxiety of living in the modern city. And there's a brilliant bit where he turns in his, I guess it's an essay rather than a dissertation, where he's sort of tracing the history of streetlights and how that they, in recent times they've turned to blue because that way, and how the council justify it, how the local government justify it, but actually it's so that junkies can't see the blue veins to shoot up under, which is, there's a lot of really interesting there's a lot of really interesting sociology in this book. And again, I'm just going to read you a bit to give you an idea about this. So this is about the sort of anxiety through the schizoid nature of cities. On the one side was what it had been and now struggled to be, forever a city of light, a capital of archaic opulence. And on the other side was a new city that was insubstantial and drifting and miserable and enduring, a strong-willed city determined to survive, a city underneath the city in the cracks, the shadows, the rifts, makeshift shelters, mattresses under stairways, on rooftops. The city of cats became the city of desperate human beings, and yet it was still full of hope. Hope that, too, was insubstantial and drifting and miserable and enduring, bric-a-brac architecture that was poor, fragile, but hardy, headstrong. Site plans that changed every day, that marked where abandonment and violence broke out every night. Floor plans of broken promises. How strange it was that each of these two cities, of these two faces of the city, should fear each other and believe itself besieged by the other. And so the city turned upon itself, as if its left hand was breaking its right. So there's a lot of really good stuff, a lot of good ideas in here. I'm going to pass over part 2, but basically the woman ends the relationship because she's going to go in search of her lost mother, who her last known place was in Bosnia during the civil war there, and how the man sort of struggles with her having gone. And then part 3, she's returned looking very haggard and drawn, and even more sort of following her tenets of catastrophe. They rekindle the relationship, even though it's changed, and they have a child, but she just can't hack it, and she to sort of save the child and him, she leaves them for good this time. And the guy, because he's so obsessed with sort of the anxiety of living in a city, he takes some amazing precautions, some really sort of invasive precautions to keep his daughter safe, and actually has her chipped like you would have a cat chipped, so he can sort of trace her all the time. She doesn't know this. And it's very much about the relationship of father to daughter. I mean, it's all done for the best reasons. I mean, that's an unacceptable over the limits of what good fathering is. But it is well motivated. So you get a lot about their relationship, but you also get stuff about how things repeat. So this little girl, as she's growing up, she's lost her mother, just like he did, just like her mother lost her mother. So the pattern is repeated, and this girl is going to go off to Bosnia in search of where her mother had been, and then she sort of winds up in a desert where it was rumoured that her mother ended up at. So a really interesting book. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. I mean, in terms of plot, there's not a lot going on, but there's sort of character studies woven in with the sort of sociological anxieties of modern living. I thought it was pretty successful, really. 4.5 stars. And on to David Markson, Going Down. So, as you all know, David Markson's my favourite author, but there are 3 periods of David Markson work. The first is the 50s and 60s, where he was doing paid gigs, and I think he wrote 2 detective novels and 1 western, which I might read one day. I think they're sort of pulp fiction, but because they're David Markson, they slightly rise above the level of that. Then we have the 70s and possibly the 80s, where he wrote 2 books, this, Going Down, and a book called Springer's Progress, which I'm very keen to read now. And then in the 90s and 2000s, up to his death, we get the experimental stuff of Wittgenstein's Mistress and what he himself referred to as the teratology of things like This Is Not a Novel, Vanishing Point, Reader's Block, and the last novel, which I absolutely love. But I'm interested to see how that emerged out of his earlier books. So at the moment I haven't been able to get hold of Springer's Progress, but I got hold of this, written in the 70s, and very enjoyable. Probably a bit unsound these days in terms of some of its sort of values and representations. But it's called Going Down because that sort of has 4 levels of meaning. One is going down from America to Mexico, i.e. going down south. Another is the sexual version of it. Going down in terms of one's fortunes are going down. and finally going down, as seen in the book, where there's a lake, but you go from sort of the hills or whatever down to you go down those hills towards the lake. Anyway, so it's essentially about a ménage à trois of American expats down in Mexico that ends in bloodshed, and a lot of this is told in sort of reverse order. And one of the women has was born with a withered hand, and was very self-conscious about that, and wouldn't go out as a kid, wouldn't socialise because she felt she was an outcast at school and would get bullied and stuff. And here in the Ménage à Trois, she recalls her parents' words to her as a child of you need to go out and be amongst people. And in this relationship, instead of it being a 1-to-1, it's a 1-to-2, and she is amongst other people, but she doesn't want to be the third cog in the wheel. So she sort of bitterly resents that advice. So as I say, there's lots of sex. There's a lot about art because she's an artist. The guy is a writer, but none of them are actually producing anything. Part of the reason they've gone down to Mexico is to get away from America, to unblock themselves. But they don't terribly successfully. And I will say the writing here about the local Mexicans who they interact with just blew me away, because you read a book like Hurricane Season, which is supposed to be a portrayal of contemporary Mexico, which I don't doubt in its veracity, but it's just unreadable for me. Here, in a much more engaging, enlightening, smooth way, in just 2 or 3 chapters where the local Mexicans are portrayed, I just think Markson does a brilliant job. And in a way, the best bits of the book for me, about this Mexican husband and wife, and just all his sort of moral failings, his drinking, his spending, his gambling, and the wife who's pregnant, left behind, and even though he's 100% in the wrong in his behaviour, sort of takes it out on her. I just thought was just amazingly well written. I wasn't entirely convinced by the 3 Americans. They seemed overly privileged, not just because they were Americans slumming it in Mexico, but they seemed to come from privileged backgrounds back in America. But it's a really good read. There's no getting away from that. So again, 4.5 stars. Most of the books this week seem to be in 4.5 stars. None of them have quite sort of elevated to the level of 5, but have all been good reads, satisfying reads. It's hard to see how he goes from here to the experimental stuff. I found very few clues to that, which brings me to the last book, which is Fair Forward, Letters from David Markson to Laura Sims. So Laura Sims is a poet, American poet, who was basically a fangirl of Markson and wrote to him saying, look, I'd really like to write an essay for a serious literary magazine on you. And he said, yeah, that's fine, that's great. Now, by this stage in the 2000s, Markson was a pretty sick man, lots of ailments, didn't go out much. If he did go, it wasn't to socialise. He would go to the Strand bookshop and sort of leaf through their racks and hang out and talk and stuff. So that when Laura Sims, who's from the Midwest, is doing a reading tour and is in New York, she's really keen to meet up with Markson. And, he's impossible to prize out to go to a restaurant. She meets him 2 or 3 times, once in his house or apartment. But he reminded me so much of Kafka. Kafka was sort of an agoraphobic, although liked to walk about anonymously in Prague. And the arrangements are so difficult. You just go backwards and forwards. The arrangements he made to meet his mistress Milena. This is sort of similar. Markson's sort of bureaucratic arrangements and then changing them and then not showing up, that sort of thing. Very similar to Kafka. And of course his sort of concern with his own sort of failing body. Kafka, who had TB. So they're very similar in many ways. But on the contrary side to that, this is very warm, it's very funny. He's really supportive of Laura Sims. So I would say probably only for Markson fans. I'm not sure if you've never read Markson, you get much out of this. And after the letters, there's a because David Markson only ever gave one public reading, and that was towards the end of his life. I think for the last book he wrote, he gave one reading in New York. So after the letters, we get the article that Laura Sins, in the end, finally wrote on David Markson. And we also get an interview between the two where he basically scripted both sides, including hers, which is kind of interesting. And then there was a sort of a David Markson celebrationary event, and we get the sort of opening speech by Anne Beattie, who was another sort of Markson fan. I was able to trace a little more the journey from Markson's early writings to his late writings with this. I got some insight. So as I say, I think for Markson aficionados rather than someone coming completely cold to it. But also, if you're a fan of Kafka's letters, you might dig this. Okay, so I see we're at just half an hour, which I think is fine. I won't split this up. I did just want to say that this is probably going to be my last recent reads wrap up for a while, because we are Sunday the 29th today. We have a long bank holiday for the Queen, reaching her whatever jubilee it is. So from Thursday, where I have a 5-day writing jag, I shall be getting back to my own book. And when I'm writing, I don't read much. I do have a buddy read ongoing. I have the last part of Robert Coover's The Public Burning to finish, which I will do on the evenings when I am working, which next week is Tuesday and Wednesday. Then I have a buddy read starting on a James Baldwin book. It's a bit of a group read. There's quite a few of us. That will be pretty much my the only book I'll be reading for the next few weeks. So, I mean, I might wrap up The Public Burning, but I'm not going to do a dedicated video on it. It really doesn't, in my mind, merit that. So there won't be that much output from me. I will do a half-year wrap-up at the end of June, because obviously that's stuff I've already read, and I can do that quite quickly and include my reading stats for the year. Currently, I've finished 62 books. I hope to finish one more tomorrow. And then obviously these two buddy reads, that'll make 65, something like that. So there's plenty I can talk about in a half-year wrap-up. Okay, but till then, till next time, whenever that will be. Thanks very much.